We're witnessing a fundamental breakdown in the transatlantic alliance that has defined Western foreign policy for over 70 years. The United States has now explicitly rejected the European Union's latest proposals for expanded war funding in Ukraine. And this isn't just another diplomatic disagreement. This is a seismic shift in how Washington views its strategic interests versus Europe's commitments. What we're seeing is the unraveling of a consensus that was never as solid as the public was led to believe. For months, European leaders have been scrambling to fill the financial void as American political support wavers, but now the U.S. has drawn a clear line. Europe must shoulder its own burden. This decision exposes three critical realities. First, the American taxpayer's appetite for indefinite proxy conflict has evaporated. Second, Washington's priorities have fundamentally shifted toward containing China, not bleeding Russia. And third, Ukraine finds itself caught between two faltering patrons, neither willing to commit the resources necessary for victory, yet both unable to articulate a coherent path to peace. The implications extend far beyond Kyiv. This moment reveals the fragility of Western unity and raises an urgent question. If the architects of this conflict can't agree on funding it, how can they possibly negotiate ending it? Let me be very clear about what's actually happening here, because the mainstream narrative completely misses the point. When we talk about the United States rejecting European proposals for war funding, we're not simply discussing budget allocations or financial disagreements between allies. We're talking about the exposure of a fundamental strategic incoherence that has plagued Western policy in Ukraine since February 2022. The European Union came to Washington with what they believed was a reasonable framework for burden sharing, essentially asking the United States to continue matching European financial commitments while both sides escalate military support. The American response was not just a polite decline, but a categorical rejection of the entire premise. And this rejection tells us something profound about where U.S. foreign policy is heading and what it means for the future of this conflict. To understand why this matters so much, we need to step back and look at how we arrived at this moment. From the very beginning of this war, there has been a dangerous ambiguity in Western strategy. Was the goal to help Ukraine defend itself and create conditions for negotiation, or was it to weaken Russia strategically, regardless of the cost to Ukraine? Different actors had different answers, but they all moved forward together because the initial consensus was easy when emotions were high and the costs seemed manageable. But now, nearly 3 years into this conflict, that ambiguity has become unsustainable. The United States has spent over $100 billion. Europe has absorbed millions of refugees and endured an energy crisis that has fundamentally damaged its industrial base, and Ukraine has suffered catastrophic human and economic losses. And yet we are no closer to a resolution than we were a year ago. The front lines have barely moved. The peace talks that briefly occurred in early 2022 have never been seriously revisited, and both sides remain locked in a war of attrition that neither can truly win. The American rejection of further coordinated funding with Europe reflects a cold calculation that is finally being made in Washington. The calculation is this: continuing this conflict indefinitely serves no vital American interest and actually undermines more important strategic priorities. Let me explain what I mean by that, because this is where the real story lies. The United States is facing what it perceives as an existential strategic competition with China. Everything in Washington's planning now revolves around the Indo-Pacific theater. The Ukraine conflict, from this perspective, has become a dangerous distraction. It's tying down resources, it's alienating potential partners in the global South who see Western policy as hypocritical, and it's actually pushing Russia closer to China rather than isolating Moscow, as was intended. The architects of American strategy are beginning to realize that they may have made a catastrophic miscalculation. Instead of weakening Russia and isolating it from the international community, the sanctions regime and the military pressure have driven Moscow into a tight embrace with Beijing, creating exactly the kind of authoritarian axis that Washington fears most. Europe, on the other hand, finds itself in a completely different position. For European leaders, particularly in Poland, the Baltic states, and Scandinavia, the threat from Russia feels immediate and existential in a way that it simply doesn't for Americans separated by an ocean. European security architecture has been fundamentally disrupted, and there's a genuine fear that if Ukraine falls or accepts a negotiated settlement that leaves Russian forces in occupied territories, it will embolden further Russian aggression. So European leaders are desperate to keep American support flowing because they know they cannot sustain Ukraine on their own. The European defense industrial base is nowhere near capable of producing the ammunition, the sophisticated weapon systems, and the intelligence support that Ukraine requires. When the United States now says it will not continue matching European funding commitments, it's essentially telling Europe that it needs to make a choice. Either find the resources yourselves or accept that this conflict needs to move toward negotiation and compromise. But here's what makes this situation so dangerous and so tragic. Neither side is actually being honest about what's achievable. The maximalist rhetoric continues. We still hear about Ukraine's territorial integrity being non-negotiable, about Russia needing to be defeated and held accountable, about Putin being a war criminal who must face justice. All of this sounds morally righteous, and on some level it is. Russia's invasion was illegal and brutal, and the suffering inflicted on Ukrainian civilians has been immense. But moral clarity doesn't change strategic reality. Russia is not going to collapse. Putin is not going to be dragged to The Hague. The Russian economy, despite sanctions that were supposed to cripple it, has adapted and continues functioning. Russia is producing artillery shells at a rate that the entire Western alliance cannot match. And most importantly, Russia has demonstrated that it's willing to absorb casualties and economic hardship at levels that no Western democracy would tolerate. So when we talk about defeating Russia militarily, we need to be honest about what that would actually require. It would require a level of Western military commitment that simply does not exist and will not materialize. It would require weapon systems and troop deployments that NATO is unwilling to provide because of the very real risk of direct confrontation between nuclear powers. The tragedy here is that Ukraine is caught in the middle of this strategic confusion. Ukrainian leaders have been told repeatedly that the West stands with them for as long as it takes. They've been given just enough support to keep fighting, but not enough to achieve the decisive victories that were promised. And now, as Western unity fractures and American support wavers, Ukraine faces the worst of all outcomes, continuing to sacrifice its people in a war that its backers are no longer willing to fully support, but being unable to negotiate from a position of strength because the West has insisted that compromise equals appeasement. President Zelensky finds himself in an impossible position. If he pushes for negotiations, he'll be accused of betraying Ukrainian sovereignty and emboldening Russian aggression. If he insists on continuing the fight for complete territorial restoration, he'll watch as Western support continues to erode and his country is left increasingly isolated. This is the consequence of a Western strategy that was never coherent, never realistic, and never truly committed to the costs that its own rhetoric demanded. What we're seeing now with the U.S. rejection of EU funding proposals is the beginning of the end of that strategic fantasy. Reality is intruding, and it's forcing difficult conversations that should have happened 2 years ago. The United States is signaling that it wants out, or at least wants to significantly reduce its commitment. Europe is panicking because it knows it cannot fill that void. And Ukraine is being told, in essence, that it needs to lower its expectations and start thinking seriously about what a negotiated settlement might look like. But here's the problem. After nearly 3 years of maximalist rhetoric, after telling the Ukrainian people that they're fighting for freedom and democracy and that the West will support them until victory is achieved, how do you suddenly shift to a narrative of compromise and territorial concessions? How do you explain to a population that has endured unspeakable suffering that the goals they were fighting for are no longer achievable? This is the political and moral minefield that Western leaders have created through their irresponsible rhetoric and their refusal to be honest about strategic limitations. And it gets worse, because the consequences of this strategic failure extend far beyond Ukraine. The developing world is watching carefully, and what they see is Western power in decline, Western unity fractured, and Western credibility severely damaged. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia have watched as the West imposed massive sanctions on Russia, seized Russian assets, and weaponized the dollar-based financial system. And they're drawing conclusions about the risks of being too dependent on Western institutions. This is accelerating the de-dollarization trend, the creation of alternative financial architectures, and the rise of non-Western power centers. The BRICS coalition is expanding not because these countries love authoritarianism, but because they want alternatives to a Western-dominated system that they now see as unreliable and hypocritical. When the United States lectures other countries about rules-based international order while simultaneously bypassing the UN Security Council, supporting actions that violate international law in other contexts, and now backing away from commitments it made to Ukraine, the message received is crystal clear. Western power is no longer what it was, and the unipolar moment is definitively over. So what happens next? The most likely scenario is a messy, protracted wind down of Western military support, accompanied by increasing pressure on Ukraine to enter serious negotiations. But those negotiations will happen from a position of weakness, with Ukraine having lost hundreds of thousands of casualties and much of its economic infrastructure destroyed. Russia will demand recognition of its territorial gains, security guarantees that limit Ukraine's Western integration, and probably the lifting of at least some sanctions. Ukraine will resist these demands, but with diminishing Western support, Kyiv's options will narrow considerably. The eventual settlement, whatever form it takes, will be portrayed as a victory by Moscow, a betrayal by many in Kiev, and a pragmatic necessity by exhausted Western leaders who just want to move on. And the lessons learned from this disaster will shape international relations for decades. Smaller nations will conclude that Western security guarantees are unreliable. Regional powers will be emboldened to pursue their interests through force, and the faith in international law and institutions will be further eroded. This is the real cost of the strategic incoherence we've witnessed. It's not just about Ukraine, as devastating as that human tragedy is. It's about the broader breakdown of the international system and the dangerous unpredictability that emerges when great powers stumble into conflicts without clear strategy, realistic goals, or honest assessment of what they're willing to sacrifice. We are living through a historical turning point, and the decisions made in the coming months will reverberate for generations. The question is whether anyone in a position of power has the courage to speak truthfully about these realities and chart a different course before the costs become even more catastrophic.